A husband and his pregnant wife set off for a weekend camping trip in Joshua Tree, sending one last photo before vanishing without a trace. For 11 years, their families clung to hope while investigators chased false sightings and dead-end theories that led them only further from the truth. Then, a hiker wandering through a remote section of the park stumbled upon something protruding from the sand. A discovery that would send investigators racing back to evidence they'd ignored for years. The last message from the desert arrived with the sterile ping of a satellite connecting to a device miles above the Earth. For Chloe, Jenna Dinger's younger sister, this modern miracle was a source of comfort. Her sister, 7 months pregnant and camping in the vast primitive expanse of Joshua Tree National Park, was still reachable. The photo that materialized on Chloe's phone screen was pure joy. Jenna, radiant and round-bellied in a blue sweater, seated before a lime green tent. Behind her, her husband Marcus knelt, his arm protectively around her, a wide, happy grin splitting his bearded face. The image was a perfect capsule of their excitement, a final adventure before their world was forever changed by the arrival of their first child. A text followed moments later. All set up for the night, the desert is beautiful. Love you. Chloe had replied instantly, sending back heart emojis and a reminder for Jenna to stay hydrated. Then she had gone to bed, picturing the couple under a canopy of brilliant desert stars. That was yesterday. Now the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across her living room floor, and the silence from Joshua Tree had grown from peaceful to unsettling. They had a plan, a simple one born of Chloe's sisterly worrying. Jenna was to call by noon the next day, just to confirm everything was fine. It was a concession to Chloe's anxiety about her heavily pregnant sister sleeping on the ground, even with the comfortable backup of their new camper van parked nearby. But noon had come and gone. At first, Chloe reasoned it away. Maybe they slept in. Maybe they went for a short hike and lost track of time. The Starlink was new. Perhaps it was finicky. But as 1 o'clock became 3 and 3 bled into 5, the rationalizations wore thin, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She called Jenna's phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called Marcus. The same result, the image on her phone, once a source of joy, now looked like a ghost. The smiles seemed frozen. The desert landscape behind them vast and menacing. The camper van, a symbol of safety and preparedness, was just a silent white box in the background. Every detail that had been reassuring yesterday, was now a source of terror. Why hadn't they packed up and left? Why hadn't they at least driven to a place with a cell signal? The questions circled, each one darker than the last. By sunset, the knot of fear in her stomach was too tight to ignore. Her hands trembling slightly, she looked up the non-emergency number for the National Park Service dispatch at Joshua Tree. She explained the situation to a calm, professional voice on the other end of the line. A 37-year-old pregnant woman and her 42-year-old husband overdue for a check-in. She forwarded the photo, the last proof of life, and described their vehicle, a white Ram ProMaster camper van. The ranger on the phone was reassuring, but the underlying procedure was clear. This was now a priority. 2 park rangers were dispatched as the last light of day faded from the sky, their headlights cutting a lonely path into the immense darkness of the park. They knew the general area the Dingers favored, a semi-secluded spot away from the main campgrounds. It took them nearly an hour of driving on paved roads and then graded dirt tracks before they saw it. Bathed in the stark white of their vehicle searchlight, the scene looked exactly like the photo Chloe had sent. The white camper van was parked on a level patch of ground. About 30 feet away, the lime green tent stood taut against the gentle night breeze. It was a perfect peaceful tableau. As the rangers approached on foot, their boots crunching on the grawly sand, the silence was absolute. There was no flicker of a campfire, no murmur of conversation. "Mr. Dinger, Mrs. Dinger," one of the rangers called out, his voice swallowed by the immense space. The only reply was the whisper of the wind through the creosote bushes. They circled the campsite. 2 camp chairs were angled toward a cold, unused fire pit. The tent flap was zipped shut. A quick look inside with a flashlight revealed 2 empty sleeping bags neatly laid out. They tried the doors of the camper van. Locked. Everything was in its place, tidy and expectant, as if the occupants had simply evaporated into the dry desert air. With the first light of dawn, the campsite transformed from a place of eerie silence into a full-blown crime scene. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, a stark artificial boundary against the natural landscape of twisted trees and ancient rock. The initial park rangers had given way to county sheriff's deputies and a team of investigators. Their first priority was gaining access to the locked camper van, which sat like a sealed metal tomb in the center of the unfolding drama. Rather than break a window, they called in a locksmith, a decision rooted in the hope of preserving every shred of potential evidence. As the locksmith worked, the lead detective, a man hardened by years of investigating crimes in these vast empty spaces, surveyed the scene. Everything was too perfect. In his experience, when people went missing in the wilderness, their campsites were often a mess, a sign of a hasty departure, a medical emergency, or an animal attack. This was different. This was sterile. The click of the van's lock breaking the morning silence was jarring. The side door slid open with a smooth metallic sigh, revealing the interior. The investigators peered inside and the mystery only intensified. The small custom-built living space was immaculate. A bed in the back was neatly made. On a small kitchenette counter, a half-empty bag of trail mix was clipped shut. A water bottle was full, and there, placed carefully side by side, were Marcus and Jenna Dillinger's wallets. An investigator, wearing latex gloves, carefully opened them. Inside was cash, credit cards, and their driver's licenses. Next to the wallets lay a secondary cell phone, an older model they likely kept for emergencies. And next to that, a bottle of Jenna's prenatal vitamins, a poignant symbol of the life that was supposed to be. The discovery of the wallets and phone was a critical turning point. People who choose to disappear to start a new life, take their money and identification. People who get lost on a hike would have their wallets on them. And no one, absolutely no one, would leave their pregnant wife's essential medication behind. The scene screamed that whatever had happened to the Dingers, it had not been planned by them. They had intended to return to this van. The only things missing were the couple themselves, the clothes on their backs, and the primary smartphone that had sent that final happy photo. The lack of any sign of a struggle inside the van was just as perplexing. There were no overturned items, no scuff marks on the floor, no trace of violence. It was as if they had been called out of the van and had simply walked away, leaving the entire infrastructure of their lives behind. As search and rescue teams began a grid search of the surrounding desert, a grim and often fruitless task in the unforgiving terrain of Joshua Tree, the investigative team turned their focus to the digital and financial lives of Marcus and Jenna Dinger. They were a well-liked couple with no known enemies. Jenna was a beloved elementary school teacher taking a year off for her pregnancy. Marcus was described as a self-employed business consultant, a friendly, outgoing man who doted on his wife. On the surface, their life was as orderly and untroubled as the interior of their camper. But in any investigation, the surface is just the starting point. The first crack in that perfect facade appeared 2 days into the investigation. A financial crimes detective tasked with a deep dive into their accounts found something the standard credit reports had missed. While their joint bank accounts and credit cards were healthy, Marcus Dinger had another hidden financial life. He was carrying a staggering amount of private debt sourced from high-interest hard money lenders. It was the kind of debt a person takes on when they can no longer secure conventional loans. It was desperate money. And according to the payment schedules, he was on the verge of defaulting. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, Marcus Dinger wasn't just a missing person. He was a man under immense secret pressure. He had a powerful motive to escape his life. The question that hung in the air of the detective's office was chilling. Was that motive powerful enough for him to discard his pregnant wife? The theory began to crystallize: and it was an ugly one. Perhaps the baby moon was a ruse. Perhaps Marcus, seeing no way out of his financial ruin, had concocted a desperate plan. This grim hypothesis gained terrifying momentum when a new lead came in. A BOLO beyond the lookout had been issued for Marcus. A gas station attendant working the graveyard shift in a dusty town over 100 miles from the park called the tip line. He remembered a man who matched Marcus's photo. The man had come in 2 nights after the Dingers were last heard from. He seemed jumpy, the attendant recalled, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. He paid for gas with crumpled bills pulled from his pocket, bought a prepaid burner phone, and most tellingly, a detailed paper road atlas of the American Southwest. The attendant remembered it because it was such an old-fashioned purchase. The man avoided eye contact, his shoulders hunched, and he left in a hurry. The attendant couldn't be 100% positive it was Marcus Dinger, but the resemblance was strong. For the investigators, this was the missing piece. A man with a secret crippling debt. A wife who likely just discovered it. A remote location. And now, a credible sighting of the husband alone buying the exact tools a fugitive would need to disappear off the grid. The narrative wrote itself. An argument in the desert turned deadly. Marcus, in a panic, hides his wife's body in the vast wilderness and flees, using a 2-day head start to begin his new life as a wanted man. The hardest part of the job was delivering this news to the family. The lead detective met with Chloe at her home. He laid out the facts as neutrally as he could. The discovery of the debt, the sighting at the gas station. He watched as the hope that had sustained her for days curdled into disbelief and then into raw fury. She shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "Absolutely not. Not Marcus." She told the detective about how Marcus had spent weeks building the baby's crib by hand, how he would read to Jenna's belly every night, how he cried with joy when they saw the first ultrasound. He wasn't a man running from his life. He was a man running toward it. "You're wrong," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "He would die for her. He wouldn't hurt her. He is a victim just like she is." In that moment, 2 irreconcilable stories were born. For the police, Marcus Dinger was a fugitive and their prime suspect. For his family, he was another missing person, and the police were wasting precious time chasing a ghost. The initial frantic energy of the search for Marcus and Jenna Dellinger inevitably slowed, then stalled, and finally dissipated like a desert mirage. The seasons turned over Joshua Tree National Park. The fierce heat of summer, baking the ground where the couple's tent once stood, followed by the crisp, cold nights of winter. The yellow crime scene tape was long gone, and nature had reclaimed the small patch of cleared earth, leaving no trace that a life-altering tragedy had begun there. In the sheriff's department, the Dinger case file, once the most active investigation in the county, was moved from the top of the pile to a drawer and eventually to a shelf in the records room, a thick manila folder filled with dead ends and unanswered questions. It was now officially a cold case. For the public, the story faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer, more immediate tragedies. But for Chloe, time offered no such relief. Every passing day was a fresh wound. She fought tirelessly to keep her sister's and brother-in-law's story alive, the lead detective for updates that never came. She refused to accept the official narrative. The image of Marcus as a fugitive killer was a fiction, a lazy conclusion drawn by investigators who couldn't be bothered to look for a more complex truth. She pointed to the complete lack of evidence that he was even alive. In the years that followed, not a single one of his credit cards was ever used. His social security number never appeared on any payroll. No credible sightings ever materialized after the initial shaky report from the gas station attendant. He had not contacted a single friend or family member. He had vanished as completely as Jenna had, a ghost who left no footprints in the world. To Chloe, this wasn't the behavior of a cunning fugitive. It was the silence of a dead man. The years stretched into a quiet, agonizing limbo. 2012 became 2013, then 2014. The original lead detective retired. New sheriffs were elected. The Dinger case became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to tourists. But for law enforcement, it was a frustrating monument to failure. Then, in the late summer of 2017, nearly 6 years after the couple disappeared, a bureaucratic decision forced the case back into the light. The Dinger's camper van, which had sat in the county impound lot acre-wing dust and storage fees, was scheduled to be released. It was a final painful piece of administrative housekeeping. Chloe, as the next of kin, had been notified to arrange for its collection. Before the vehicle could be released, however, department policy dictated a final thorough inventory. It was a thankless task that fell to a young, meticulous deputy who had only been a rookie when the case first broke. The impound lot was a desolate place, a vehicle graveyard where every car, truck, and van was a chapter in a story of misfortune or malice. The Dinger van sat in a back row, its white paint now dull and strewn with grime. The deputy unlocked it, the air inside stale and hot. He began his methodical work, clipboard in hand, checking off the items listed on the original evidence manifest. Sleeping bags, camp stove, first aid kit, it was all there, a time capsule from that last fateful night. He worked his way through the small living space, noting the condition of the custom-built cabinetry that Marcus, a skilled woodworker, had installed himself. As he ran a gloved hand along a bank of overhead storage bins, his fingers detected a subtle imperfection. One of the vertical seams between two cabinets didn't feel right. It was almost too perfect, lacking the tiny gap that should have been there. Curious, he pushed on it. It didn't budge. He tapped it with his knuckle. The sound was different from the surrounding panels. Not a solid thud, but a hollow, resonant echo. His pulse quickened slightly. This wasn't on any inventory sheet. This was something new. He retrieved a multi-tool from his belt and carefully worked the thin flathead screwdriver bit into the hairline crack of the seam. With a gentle twist, a hidden magnetic latch released and the panel popped open with a soft click, revealing a dark rectangular cavity. The deputy shone his flashlight into the hidden compartment. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. A weapon, a stash of cash, a confessional letter. But it was none of those things. Inside, lying diagonally, was a single object, a gray cylindrical waterproof map tube, the kind a serious architect or engineer might use. It was completely sealed. He carefully removed the tube, his mind racing. This was not the work of a man in a panic. This was careful concealment. This was premeditation. Back at the station, the discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the cold case unit. The tube was unsealed in a sterile evidence room. A senior detective, a veteran who remembered the initial frustration of the case, carefully slid out the contents. It wasn't one map, but a series of them tightly rolled together. As they were unfurled on a large table, it was clear these were not standard tourist maps. They were highly detailed professional-grade geological surveys. They depicted a specific remote sector of Joshua Tree National Park, an area far from any established trails or campgrounds, known for its rugged terrain and complex rock formations. But it was the handwritten annotations that truly baffled the investigators. The maps were covered in small, neat notes written in pencil. They were cryptic technical references. Pegmatite dikes, prominent Czech alluvium for float and coordinates, followed by notations like possible monazite. This was the language of a prospector. The discovery completely shattered the established theory of the case. The man seen buying a simple road atlas at a gas station was a red herring, a ghost. It was loose and churned up, littered with the kind of debris that suggested recent animal activity, most likely a coyote digging for a rodent. It was a common enough sight, but something about this particular spot held his attention. In the center of the disturbed earth, he saw a glint of white. Not the bright white of bleached rock, but a dull off-white, almost yellowish color. His first thought was that it was a piece of trash, or perhaps an animal bone. He was annoyed for a moment at the thought of careless visitors leaving their rubbish behind, even out here. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a hiker's instinct to leave no trace, he stepped closer. The white object was partially buried, curved in a way that seemed strangely familiar. He nudged it with the toe of his hiking boot, expecting it to be a light piece of plastic or a sun-baked bone from a bighorn sheep. The object didn't just move. The sand around it crumbled away, revealing more of its shape. And in that instant, the world tilted on its axis for Derek Vincent. It wasn't one bone. It was a series of them fused together in a horrifyingly recognizable pattern. The curve he had seen was the elegant arching shape of a human rib. He was looking at a human rib cage. He stumbled back, a gasp of cold air catching in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum beat in the sudden, profound silence of the desert. He looked again, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was undeniably real. He could see the distinct parallel lines of individual ribs emerging from the sand. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling, clumsy with a sudden rush of adrenaline. He stabbed at the screen, dialing 911. The voice of the dispatcher was a calm, grounding presence in his swirling panic. 911, what is your emergency? I found something, Derek stammered, his voice thin and ready. A body, I think. Bones. Human bones. The dispatcher's tone remained level. Professional. Okay, sir. Can you tell me your location? Derek looked around wildly, the familiar landscape now feeling alien and threatening. He tried to describe his position, referencing the sun, the shape of the boulder formation, the direction he'd walked from the nearest dirt road. He could hear the clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line as the dispatcher tried to pinpoint his coordinates. The process felt like an eternity. He was told to stay put, not to touch anything, and that units were on their way. After he hung up, he sat on a rock a good 50 feet away from the site, his back to it, unable to look again. He just stared out at the empty desert. The image of the rib cage burned into his mind. Within the hour, the silence was broken by the distant sound of approaching vehicles. 2 park rangers arrived first, their faces grim and professional as Derek recounted his discovery. They confirmed the remains were human, and immediately established a wide perimeter. Their yellow tape a stark declaration that this patch of wilderness was now a crime scene. The initial rangers were soon joined by sheriff's deputies and most importantly the county's forensic investigation unit. The lead forensic archaeologist, a woman with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen more than most, directed the operation with a quiet authority. This was not a recovery. It was an excavation. The process was painstaking, almost reverent. Her team set up a grid system over the shallow grave. They didn't use shovels. They used telephones, dental picks, and soft bristled brushes. With the delicate precision of surgeons, they began to remove the layers of sand and soil, one grain at a time. As the afternoon wore on, the full extent of the burial was revealed. The skeleton was remarkably complete, preserved by the dry desert air. It was positioned in a seated, almost fetal position, with the knees drawn up toward the chest. The skull was intact, the empty eye sockets staring out at a world that had moved on without them for more than a decade. It was the skeleton of an adult female. As the team carefully brushed away the last of the sand from the abdominal and pelvic region, the lead archaeologist suddenly paused. She motioned for her colleague to look. There, nestled within the protective cradle of the female skeleton's pelvic bones, lay another, impossibly small and fragile skeleton. The tiny, delicate bones of a skull, a miniature rib cage, the thread-like bones of limbs. It was the perfectly formed skeleton of a fetus, lying exactly where it had been in its mother's womb. A hush fell over the entire team. Even the seasoned deputies looked away. This wasn't just one victim. It was 2. After 11 years of silence, buried under layers of sand and secrets, Jenna Dinger and her unborn child had finally been found. The discovery of Jenna Dinger's remains sent a seismic shock wave through the county sheriff's department. The Dinger file, a cold case so dormant it was practically fossilized, was abruptly reactivated. This was no longer a missing persons case, shadowed by the ambiguous possibility of a husband on the run. This was a homicide. The location of the grave in a remote, almost inaccessible part of the park immediately nullified the long-held theory that Marcus had killed his wife in a spontaneous fit of rage near their campsite and fled. This burial was deliberate, calculated, and required intimate knowledge of the park's hidden corners. The fugitive theory which had guided the investigation for over a decade evaporated under the harsh desert sun. The entire case had been reset to zero. A new task force was assembled, blending veteran detectives who remembered the original case with younger officers who brought fresh perspectives and familiarity with new forensic technologies. Their first and most critical task was a complete review of the mountain of old evidence. A detective named Miles Corbin, a man nearing retirement who had been a junior officer back in 2011, was assigned the painstaking job of rereading every report, every interview transcript, every dead-end lead in the original file. He spent 2 days immersed in the case's history, the faded ink and typewritten pages, a testament to a decade of frustration. On the third day, he came across the supplemental report from 2017, the discovery of the hidden compartment in the camper van. He read the description of the waterproof tube and the geological maps found inside. He pulled up the digitized images of the maps, their surfaces covered in Marcus Dinger's cryptic handwritten notes. A jolt went through him. He cross-referenced the GPS coordinates from the newly discovered grave site with the annotations on the maps. It was a perfect match. The shallow pit where Jenna and her baby were found lay directly within a large hand-drawn circle on one of Marcus' surveys. The forgotten clue, the baffling discovery that had led nowhere 6 years prior, was suddenly the Rosetta Stone of the entire investigation. The maps weren't just a random curiosity. They were a direct link between the victim and the place of her burial. Marcus Dinger hadn't been a simple tourist. He had been drawn to that specific desolate spot for a reason. The question was no longer if he was there, but why. While Corbin was connecting the dots of the past, the remains of Jenna and her child were undergoing a meticulous examination at the county medical examiner's office. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case faced a formidable challenge. 11 years in the desert had erased all soft tissue, leaving only bone. Determining a precise cause of death would be difficult, if not impossible. A visual inspection revealed no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet holes in the skull, no nicks on the ribs from a knife, no fractures indicative of a blunt force injury. The skeleton was a silent witness, its secrets locked away by time. Unwilling to give up, the anthropologist decided to employ a more advanced technique, scanning electron microscopy. The process involved taking microscopic samples from the surface of the bones to search for trace evidence that might have been left behind by a weapon or the environment of the attack itself. She focused on the cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck, as they are often marked in cases of strangulation or other forms of asphyxiation. Under the immense magnification of the electron microscope, she found something. It wasn't a mark from a ligature, but something even stranger. Embedded in the porous microscopic matrix of the bone's surface were tiny, almost infinite decimal particles of a fine granular dust. The particles were metallic and unusually dense. They were not a naturally occurring component of the desert soil. This was a foreign substance introduced to the bone at or around the time of death. The discovery was highly unusual. The anthropologist carefully collected a sample of the trace particles and sent them to a specialized forensics lab with expertise in materials science and geology. The question was simple. What was this mysterious dust and where did it come from? The investigation now had 2 powerful converging lines of inquiry. The first was the map which proved that the burial site was not random. It was a destination. This fact completely shifted the focus of the investigation. Detectives were no longer looking for a man who had run away from his life. They were looking for someone connected to that specific piece of land, someone who knew what Marcus Dinger was doing out there. The second line of inquiry was the microscopic dust, a physical clue that held the potential to link a suspect directly to the victim's body. The task force pivoted. They set aside the old theories about marital strife and financial desperation. The key to this murder, they now believed, lay not in the Dingers' personal lives, but in Marcus' secret professional one. They began the arduous process of reconstructing his business dealings from over a decade ago, pulling old corporate filings, tax records, and phone logs. They were no longer hunting for Marcus Dinger. They were hunting for his associates. They were looking for the other player in the dangerous game that had led him and his pregnant wife to that desolate spot in the desert. The ghost of Marcus the fugitive was finally laid to rest, replaced by the image of Marcus the victim, a man who had stumbled upon a secret worth killing for. The new direction of the investigation felt like excavating an archaeological site of its own. Records from over a decade ago were archived. Businesses had dissolved and people had moved on. The detectives began by re-examining the crippling debt that had made Marcus Dinger such an attractive suspect in 2011. This time they didn't just look at the numbers. They looked at the names. They traced the origin of the high-interest loans and discovered they weren't from shadowy loan sharks, but were part of a complex and acrimonious business dissolution. The money Marcus owed was tied directly to the breakup of his consulting partnership. His partner, a man named Leland Croft, had been the one to call in the debts, initiating a series of aggressive legal maneuvers just weeks before the Dingers disappeared. Leland Croft. The name had appeared in the original case file, but only peripherally. He had been interviewed briefly in 2011, expressing shock and sadness over his former partner's disappearance. He had confirmed their business relationship was ending, but had characterized it as a mutual, if somewhat tense, parting of ways. At the time, with the fugitive theory in full force, there had been no reason to look at him more closely. Now he was the center of everything. The investigators began to build a profile of Leland Croft, and as they dug, the pieces began to snap into place with an alarming clarity. They pulled his old credit card statements and public records. While his professional life was in business consulting, his personal passion, bordering on obsession, was geology. He had subscriptions to obscure mining journals, receipts for rock tumblers and Geiger counters, and most tellingly, records of purchasing specialized geological survey software. Leland Croft wasn't just an amateur. He was a dedicated, knowledgeable prospector. The cryptic notes on Marcus maps suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't Marcus notes. They were likely Leland's, or at the very least, they were written in his language. A new chilling theory began to emerge, one that recontextualized every element of the case. The consulting business, the task force now believed, was a front, or at the very least, Leland Croft was using its legitimate operations as a cover for his true passion, illegal prospecting for valuable rare earth minerals within the protected boundaries of Joshua Tree National Park. The partnership hadn't ended over simple business disagreements. It had ended because Marcus Dinger, an honest man, had discovered what Leland was doing. The debt wasn't a sign of Marcus' failure. It was a weapon Leland was using against him in their dispute. The Baby Moon camping trip was now seen in a terrifying new light. It wasn't a final romantic getaway. It was a confrontation. Marcus, likely armed with copies of the maps and other evidence he had gathered, had gone to Joshua Tree not to relax, but to put a stop to Leland's operation. Perhaps he intended to gather final irrefutable proof to turn over to the authorities. Or perhaps more dangerously, he had arranged to meet Leland directly to confront him one last time in the very place where the illegal activity was happening. He had brought Jenna along, most likely under the guise of the Baby Moon, never revealing the true perilous nature of their trip. The camper van wasn't just for comfort. It was a mobile base of operations for a man who was about to blow the whistle on a secret enterprise worth a considerable amount of money. Leland Croft was no longer a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. The motive was clear and powerful, silencing Marcus to protect his lucrative illegal operation. The investigators revisited the original sighting at the gas station, the one that had sent the investigation down the wrong path for 11 years. They pulled the grainy surveillance footage from 2011. The quality was poor, but the man at the counter bore a definite passing resemblance to Leland Croft. Same general build, same hairline. It was now sickeningly clear what had likely happened. Leland hadn't just killed the Dingers, he had brilliantly and cynically orchestrated the aftermath. He had murdered his partner and the only witness, then driven miles away to a random gas station where he, a man who looked vaguely like Marcus, deliberately bought the items a fugitive would need. He had created a false trail, a perfect piece of misdirection that had successfully diverted all suspicion from himself for over a decade. He had not only committed the perfect crime, but had framed a dead man for it. The task force now had a solid coherent theory, a compelling motive, and strong circumstantial evidence linking Leland Croft to the victim's secret activities and the location of the crime. But they knew it wasn't enough. A good defense attorney would tear it apart in court, dismissing it as speculation and coincidence. They had a story, but they needed proof. They needed something that physically tied Leland Croft to the murder of Jenna and Marcus Dinger. The entire weight of the case now rested on the results from the forensics lab on the identity of the mysterious microscopic dust found clinging to Jenna's bones. Leland Croft was found in a small sun-drenched town in central Oregon, a world away from the harsh deserts of Southern California. He was the owner and sole proprietor of Croft's Hardware and Feed, a tidy, well-organized store that smelled of sawdust, fertilizer, and honest work. When Detective Corbin and his younger partner walked in, Leland was advising a customer on the best type of fungicide for rose bushes. He was 54 now, thicker around the middle, his hair gray at the temples, but he had the same calm, assured demeanor they remembered from his original witness statement. He looked up, offering a polite, professional smile that faltered slightly when he saw their badges. He agreed to accompany them to the local police station to clear up some old questions with a sigh of weary cooperation, as if this were a tedious but necessary piece of bureaucratic red tape from a lifetime ago. In the sterile, gray-walled interrogation room, Leland's composure was a fortress. He sat back in his chair, hands resting calmly on the metal table, and projected an air of patient helpfulness. He listened as Corbin began walking him back through the events of 2011. Leland's answers were smooth, consistent, and unchanged from his original story. Yes, the business dissolution with Marcus had been difficult. Yes, there was money involved. Partnerships end, he said with a dismissive shrug. It's like a divorce. It's never pleasant, but it's just business. Marcus was a good man, a bit of a dreamer. I was devastated when I heard what happened. Corbin pushed, presenting the first piece of new evidence. He slid a large color printout of one of the geological maps across the table. We found these, Leland, hidden in a secret compartment in Marcus's van. These look like a prospector's maps. Your notes, perhaps. Leland leaned forward, squinting at the map with mild curiosity. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. My notes number. Marcus got into all sorts of strange hobbies. He had a brief obsession with gold panning one year, then it was meteorite hunting. This was probably another one of his phases. He thought he was going to strike it rich in the desert. I told him he was wasting his time. He expertly deflected the question, turning the evidence of a secret operation into a character flaw of the victim. He painted Marcus as a naive dreamer and himself as the grounded practical partner. The fortress of his denial seemed impenetrable. Corbin pressed on detailing the bitter financial dispute, the aggressive legal letters Leland's lawyer had sent just before the disappearance. Leland didn't flinch. As I said, it was a business divorce. Lawyers get involved. Things get ugly. It's regrettable, but it's standard procedure. It has nothing to do with him and Jenna going missing. Every piece of circumstantial evidence the detectives presented, Leland caught and calmly dismantled with a plausible, rational explanation. For a moment, a sliver of doubt entered Corbin's mind. Was it possible they were wrong? That this was all just a string of incredible coincidences? Then came a knock at the door. A uniformed officer entered and handed Detective Corbin a sealed evidence envelope. It was the report from the Materials Analysis Lab. This was the moment. Corbin opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the technical language of the report. He looked up, his gaze locking with Leland's. The air in the room grew heavy. When the medical examiner inspected Jenna's remains, Corbin began, his voice low and steady. She found something unusual, a fine metallic dust embedded in the bones of her neck. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. We sent a sample to the lab for analysis. The substance is called dorite, Leland. It's a radioactive rare earth mineral. It's not something you just find anywhere. In fact, it's only found in commercially viable concentrations in a few places in North America. Corbin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. One of those places happens to be the exact isolated patch of desert where you were prospecting and where we found Jenna's body. For the first time, a crack appeared in Leland Croft's fortress. It was barely perceptible. A slight tightening of the muscles in his jaw. A flicker of something cold and dark in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. Contamination from the soil. It's a coincidence. The words were weak, lacking the confident authority he had projected moments before. The science was a wall he couldn't talk his way around. Before Leland could recover, Corbin's partner slid a second file across the table. He opened it to reveal two photographs side by side. This is what really changes things, Leland, the younger detective said, his tone sharp. We couldn't see this back in 2011. The technology wasn't there, but we reanalyzed the original crime scene photos from inside the camper van. He pointed to the first image, a digitally enhanced, high-contrast picture of a faint dusty footprint on the van's interior step. It was now shockingly clear. He then pointed to the second photo. This is the tread pattern from a pair of redback geological boots, a specialized brand. Your preferred brand according to your credit card records from that time. They're a perfect match. Leland stared at the photographs. The dorite had placed him at the burial site. The boot print placed him inside the van. The two pieces of evidence were like the jaws of a vice closing in on him from opposite sides. There was no more room for denial. There was nowhere left to run. The collapse was total. The calm, confident hardware store owner dissolved, replaced by a man drowning in a memory he had held underwater for 11 years. His shoulders slumped. The color drained from his face. He stared at his hands on the table as if they belonged to a stranger. A long shuddering breath escaped his lips. A sound of profound and final defeat. He wasn't supposed to bring her, Leland whispered, the words tumbling out, thick with a decade of silence. He recounted the story in a broken, disjointed torrent. The meeting was his idea, a final angry confrontation at his prospecting site. He was furious that Marcus was threatening to expose him. The argument escalated. Marcus was righteous, unbending. In a fit of pure rage, Leland had struck him with a heavy rock hammer he kept with his tools. Marcus went down and he didn't get up. And then he turned and Jenna was standing there by the van, her face a mask of pure horror. She had seen everything. I didn't have a choice, he choked out the pathetic classic excuse of a murderer. He described in cold detail how he had killed her, buried her in a prospect pit. He had already dug and then returned for Marcus' body, dumping it down the shaft of a nearby abandoned mine he knew of. The trip to the gas station was a final cynical masterstroke of inspiration, a way to throw the police off his trail forever by framing the man he had just murdered. The interrogation room was silent except for the sound of Leland Croft's ragged, sobbing breaths. The fortress had crumbled to dust. The case, after 11 years of agonizing mystery, was finally brutally closed. The confession of Leland Croft did not end the investigation. It launched its final grim chapter. While Croft was processed and held without bail, a massive search operation was mobilized. Its focus now narrowed from the entirety of Joshua Tree National Park to a few square miles of rugged mine-scarred badlands, the area Leland had described in his confession. The mission was no longer a search for a missing person, but a recovery operation. They needed to find Marcus Dinger. The terrain was treacherous, dotted with the open mouths of abandoned mine shafts from a long-forgotten prospecting boom. These shafts were vertical tombs, some hundreds of feet deep, their wooden supports rotted and their edges unstable. Sending personnel down was deemed too dangerous. Instead, the task force brought in a specialized team from a state university's robotics lab. Their tools were a fleet of advanced Remotech-controlled drones small enough to navigate the narrow shafts equipped with high-intensity lights and high-resolution cameras. For 2 days, the operation unfolded under the relentless desert sun. The team worked methodically, moving from one abandoned mine to the next. The drone operators sat in the cool, air-conditioned darkness of a command vehicle, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their monitors, watching the live feed as the drones descended into the earth. The images sent back were claustrophobic and tense, rough-hewn rock walls, dangling roots, the occasional desiccated carcass of an animal that had fallen in. Shaft after shaft revealed nothing but darkness and debris. On the afternoon of the second day, a drone was lowered into a particularly deep and narrow shaft, one that Leland had marked on a map from memory. It descended past 50 feet, then 100. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the drone's powerful LED lights. At approximately 150 feet, the drone's camera tilted downwards, and the operator suddenly froze. At the very bottom of the shaft, tangled in a mess of discarded timber and rockfall, was a shape that was unmistakably human. The operator zoomed in, the camera lens adjusting to the darkness. The image sharpened, resolving into the chillingly clear sight of skeletal remains clad in the tattered remnants of clothing. A quiet, somber confirmation was relayed over the radio. They had found him. A specialized recovery team using a complex system of ropes and harnesses was dispatched to the shaft. The painstaking process took several hours. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the landscape, the remains of Marcus Dinger were brought back to the surface for the first time in 11 years. Dental records provided a swift and certain identification. With the recovery of both victims, the story of their disappearance was finally complete. Leland Croft, facing an ironclad case built on his own confession and the irrefutable forensic evidence, was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Chloe and the rest of her family, the verdict brought not joy, but a profound and aching sense of closure. The terrible weight of not knowing, which they had carried for more than a decade, was finally lifted.